Hey everyone, and welcome to my first JavaScript CodeAlong. Today we'll be building this awesome, captivating, what I like to call a flashlight 404 error page. Inspiration comes from Skillshare's 404 page that has something similar to this, and I wanted to recreate it. So if we look at what's going on, you can see that there's this circle that follows our mouse wherever we go, and it goes behind the text. And it's very simple, but we're gonna just break it down and build this step by step together, and I'll show you everything it takes to make an awesome, captivating 404 page. Let's take a look. Okay, so to start, if you want to have the starter files, I have the repo available on my GitHub, which I will link in the description. If you want to start from scratch, it's just a basic HTML boilerplate with our main.css style linked. And in our main.css, we just have a font that I'm importing from Google Fonts to make it a little nicer looking, zeroing out all the margin and padding, and setting box sizing to border box. And the HTML, we're just defining the font family that we want to use, the font size, and then just a standard off-white font color. And just with the body, we're just setting the height to 100% or 100 view height, and any overflow will be hidden. Just some basic starting point for our CSS to kind of give us a full screen. Alright, so how do we get this? Alright, well, to start, let's look at our index file, and we need a couple different things. First thing we're going to need is a container to put this all in. Okay, so if we load our index file, indexstart.html, into the browser, and I'm using a plugin for live reloading, and it is called Live Server. This one, check it out, and it basically anytime you make a change, it'll push it right away to the browser without having to reload, and it just makes it a lot nicer. So check that out if you have any questions about the live reload. Okay, so we have a blank screen. Great. What do we do with that? Alright, so the first thing we need to do is make a container. Let's start by making a div with the ID of container. And inside of this, we're going to put another div, and it's not going to have anything in it, but we're going to give it an ID of flashlight. And you might be able to figure out what that's going to be used for. And underneath that, we're just going to make a div with some headings in it, and I'll just give that a class of headings. And inside the headings, we're going to have our h1 with an ID of display, and that's just so we can grab it and make the font bigger through CSS. Alright, and underneath this h1, we're going to put an h3 or something, and we'll just say, whoops, something seems to have been misplaced, or any type of like humanized, nice user message. We just like to give it sort of a human element to it. Alright, and underneath that h3, we're just going to add one more heading, an h4, and we're just going to say, don't worry, we'll get it sorted out. Okay. So let's see, what do we got here? We got this thing. Oh, in our h1 we need to put some text, so let's just do 404. Alright, what do we have with this? Okay, cool. Well, that's kind of what we're looking for. Not really, but we're getting there. So, now that we have our markup in place, we can go and take a look at the CSS. So in our CSS file, let's start by giving the container some properties. So let's say container, and in that we have to give it a height of 100%, and with this we're going to set the display to flex, set the flex to 1, and that'll basically just take up the whole container, any available space. And then we're also going to set flex direction to column. Oh, there we go, column. And what that's going to do is it's going to take the flow of Flexbox, instead of going from left to right or horizontal, it's going to change the axis to go top to bottom or vertical. You'll see why we do this in just a second. Alright, so after flex direction, we have to add our justify content, and we'll center that, and that's going to center it vertically. In this case, since the flow of Flexbox is vertically, if we were to have this in a row, it would be centered horizontally. So it's kind of switched. If you want to learn more about Flexbox and how it works, you can check out an awesome tutorial and free course by Wes Bos that I will link in the description. Check it out. It's completely free and you'll learn a lot. Anyways, alright, so after justify content, we're gonna set the align items property. Again, Flexbox, and we're gonna click center, or select center for that as well, and you see that that indeed centers it vertically and horizontally now. Alright, and the last thing we got to do with the container is we're going to set a background color. And I like to do just something dark, but you can choose whatever you want. We're just looking for a nice contrast between the text and the background color of the div, and we're also looking for a nice contrast between the flashlight, the text, and the background color. So it's just kind of a 3-color scheme contrast that you want to keep in mind. And so I'll just set something simple like 1, 1, 1, and look at that. It looks pretty decent. You don't really want to use complete FFF white or 0, 0, 0 black. It's just very unnatural looking, so try and keep it off a little bit if you can, and it'll just help your design overall a lot better, at least in my experience. Okay, so the next thing we got to do is set some rules for the headings. So let's grab the headings div, and we're gonna say text align center, and I'll just center everything. With the headings, we need to set the position to relative, and that's not going to change anything, but it does set the position in the rule, and that enables us to adjust the Z index, which is important in this design. And it's all about layering, and the Z index is basically, if you ever worked with Photoshop, it's like the layers in your project, and Z indexing works kind of the same way with different elements. Every element will have its own Z index. Usually it's just set at 0 unless you specify otherwise. So we're going to do that right now. So let's type in Z index, and let's just give it 50, and the range for Z index is pretty wide. It's like negative numbers to 9999, and I like to give myself plenty of space to work in between, because if I ever need to add anything or any type of element in between certain layers, it's nice to have, 10 different layers to pick from instead of having to move everything around just to make space for one thing to fit in between 2 layers set at like Z index 10, Z index 11. And that's just what I like to do. So the next thing, let's just bump up the font size for this a little bit. And let's just say 1.3 rems, and that'll give it a little bit bigger. Cool. Okay. Next thing we want to do is we're going to adjust the display text, which is, if you remember this 404, it's got the ID of display. So we're just going to take that, and we're just going to bump up the font size pretty good on this one. So we're going to just say, let's say 7 rems. And rems just refers to whatever is defined in the HTML font size. If that's defined in HTML, that's what it's going to go off of. The difference between M and rem is M is relative to the parent element's font size, sort of, so to speak, whereas the rem will always go off of this HTML defined font size. So a little bit more of a stable control over your font sizing, and especially if you're using M's for padding and sizing, rem is a very solid way to use it. Okay, so now with our display in there and big and awesome, the last thing we got to do is make this flashlight element. Alright, so let's grab the flashlight div, ID of flashlight, and the first thing we want to do is set the position to absolute. And you'll see why we do that in a second. And you don't see anything yet, but let's change that. Alright, so next thing we gotta set is the height, and we'll do just 300 pixels. And we're also gonna set the width and we're gonna do it the same thing, 300 pixels, and that'll give us a square. And let's put some color in this square so we can see it. How about that? All right, so background color white, and you can see that square. And let's just change this to something that works. Okay, cool. Alright, so let's turn this square into a circle. So how do we do that? Well, with the square div, we just apply a border radius on it with something completely outrageous. So we'll just say like 50%, and you can see that it just, boom, a circle. Awesome. So now, what do we got to do? Alright, so the way this thing works is it adjusts the positioning of it with the absolute positioning through JavaScript, and so we have to have an initial point for it to rest at, so we can grab those elements or those styles and adjust them. So let's set those, and we'll do, this is where the position absolute comes in. So we'll set, let's just set a top of 150 pixels and left 200 pixels. Alright, so it puts it right about there. Cool. And the last thing we need to do for this guy is make sure that it is in fact underneath the text and anything else that we might want to hover behind with it. So we need to just set the Z index, and I'm just going to set it at 10, and that'll give us plenty of space if we ever want to add different elements onto this, and as well as like a little navigation link or a back button or anything like that. So it just gives us more space to work with in the future. So with our CSS finished, let's go ahead and start writing some JavaScript. So if we go back to our HTML file and we go down to the scripts tag, there's two things that we're going to have to grab off of our document. First thing is going to be the container, this whole thing. So, and what we're going to do with that is we're going to attach a listener event to it. So let's grab that with const, and we'll just say const container equals document dot get element by ID, and it is the container. Cool. Alright, and then the next thing we want to grab is the flashlight. So we'll grab that div const flashlight equals document dot get element by ID flashlight. Okay, cool. Now that we have our DOM selectors accounted for, there's two variables that we're going to have to declare in order to keep track of our X position and our Y position for our flashlight div. Alright, so we'll have to declare them using the let keyword, and we'll just do let X position equal, let's just say 0, and let Y position equal 0. Alright, and this is just, X is going to refer to the horizontal axis and Y is going to refer to the vertical axis in this. Okay, so now what do we got to do? Well, we got to attach an event listener, and what do we have to listen for? Well, we're going to listen for the mouse move event, and basically whenever our mouse is moving inside of this parent div of container, we're going to register that movement with the event object. Okay, so let's add that event listener. So we'll say container dot add event listener, and this takes two arguments. The first one is the event we're going to listen for, which is a mouse move, and then what we want to happen after that. So you can either put a function in here, or you can write an anonymous function and run multiple things in there, and that's what we're going to do at this point. Alright, so we're going to just write function, anonymous function, and the important thing in this is we have to pass in the event object so we can access that inside of our function. Okay, so how do we look at this event object? Well, let's take a look. Let's say console.log e, and that's gonna refer to this guy right here, the event object that we're passing in. So what happens if we do this? Alright, let's take a look. Open up the console and pull that up like that. You can see all of this stuff going on right here. All of these mouse events, mouse move events. That's all the information that happens each time we move the mouse. It's calculating and giving us that information through the event object. So if you look inside of this, we're going to see a ton of different stuff, but what we're looking for, if you want to look around in this, it's pretty cool. There's a ton of different stuff you can play around and really learn what's going on. But what we're looking for is two things. It's the client X and the client Y. So if we look at that a little bit closer, if I type e.clientx in the console log, and we can watch as I move my mouse in, you can see that the numbers are decreasing as I move to the left and increasing as I move to the right, and that's referring to the mouse position in relevance to the window. Okay, so what do we do with that? Cool. Well, what we got to do is we're going to update our X position and our Y position with the client X and the client Y. So how do we go about doing that? We're going to just set X position equals e.clientx. Next, we're going to type in the same thing, but for the Y position. So Y position equals e.clientY. So now we have our X position and Y position updating with the position of the mouse. And so what we can do is take that off, and just to see a visual representation, we can console.log and pass in X position and Y position, and that'll show us the XY coordinates. Oh, if I spell this right. There we go. Alright, X and Y coordinates. Okay, so let's take that information and update the location of our flashlight div. So to do that, we're going to have to write a function. So we'll type function, and we're going to call this update coordinates. And that's going to take two parameters. We're going to pass in an X and a Y. And inside that function, we're going to grab the flashlight, and we'll grab the styles, and then we'll say left, referring to the horizontal axis, and we'll set that equal to a template literal. And inside the variable, we're going to pass in X, and then we just have to add pixels to convert it to a pixel value, and that should set the pixel value for the position of the flashlight for the X position. And the next thing we got to do is just grab the flashlight and the styles and set the top value. And we're going to do the same thing in a template literal, pass in Y with the pixel prefix on it. And that should be all that we need. So in order to call this function, let's just place it inside the event listener so that it calls each time that an event gets logged. And what we'll pass in there is the X position and the Y position. And that should be all there is to it. So if we now look at our project and the HTML file in the browser, it should be updating its position, and we can check and look at that. Oh boy. Well, you notice that it's not quite center around the mouse, or it's kind of off to the top left corner. Well, that is because this is in fact a square, and the start point of this element that is placing the positioning is in fact the top left corner, 0, 0 of the element. So in order to adjust that, we're going to have to put a transform on the styles of that flashlight, and it's basically just going to move it, the start point, to the center of the element. And so to do that, we're just going to type in the transform property, and we'll do translate, and we have to translate both the Y and the X axis, and we'll do -50% and -50%. And with that in there, that should be all that we need, and it should be centered, and look at that. Cool. Well, now we have our awesome 404 landing page, catch page, and it's captivating. If your user comes across this, they might be more intrigued than disappointed, so that's always a plus, especially in the UI UX world today. And this is just a starting point, a jumping off point. Again, it was inspired by Skillshare, so go on to their website, skillshare.com/undefined, and you can take a look at it. I hope you enjoyed this live code along, and I would love to see what you do with it, and my project will be available on GitHub for you to download the starter files. Feel free to send me anything that you've done with this. I'd love to see your work, and thank you for watching. Feel free to come back for more content. Like, comment, and subscribe. I will be doing live code streams as well as more code along videos and tutorials in the near future. Thank you so much for watching, and have an awesome day.